So I just thought I'd start off. This is, I think, a 1985 Dodge Daytona. This was my second car. I just graduated high school. I was moving from the sticks of central Missouri up to the big city of Kansas City and traded my Jeep or sold my Jeep, bought this. And I moved up to Kansas City to go to college. And while I was there, you see that black covering over the back window, that louver. I decided, I was like, I don't really like that louver. So I took it off and I was living with my aunt and uncle. And I love my aunt and uncle to death. They're super generous, kind, loving people. And they're also the type of people who collect a lot of stuff, if you know what I mean. And so I took the louver off my car, shoved it in their garage where they had a bunch of other stuff and kind of really forgot about it. Finished school, got married, moved away, have not thought about this car for, 26 years, basically. Literally just about 2 months ago, I get a call from my aunt and she's like, Steve, we were cleaning out our garage and we found this old thing for your Dodge, your Daytona. I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I was like, she goes, the thing that goes over the back window. I'm like, no, not ringing any bells. I can't, literally, I have no idea. She goes, yeah, it's like a louver or something. And I said, oh, I completely forgot about that. I just said, yeah, I'm sorry. I left that in your garage for 27 years. I said, just feel free to toss it. She goes, no way. I'm not going to throw that out. She goes, let me mail it to you. I'm like, you're going to mail me the louver? I said, no, please just throw it away. No, I can't do that. She said, we're going to have a garage sale. I'm going to sell it and give you the money. I was like, look, you've stored it and you housed me for 3 years while I was going to college. You've also stored this for 27 years. I think the $10 you're going to get for it is not enough. So I said, feel free to sell it, keep the money, do whatever you want with it. So I kind of laughed, forgot about it. And actually, I thought it was a pretty funny story. About a month later, I was visiting some relatives, my mom and stuff back in the Missouri area. My aunt and uncle came over. We all had dinner. And the louver came up again. I just said, I can't believe that you guys have had that in your garage for 27 years. And I was like, what, that's just kind of funny that you have that junk in there. And another uncle is there who's sort of a guy who restores cars and whatnot. And he goes, what? You have a louver for a 1985 Dodge Daytona? He goes, Steve. He calls me Steve. He goes, Stevie, man, that thing's probably worth $500. And I was like, what? That old piece of junk from off that car that's been stored in there for 27 years is worth $500. So the funny thing is, I guess, you see from my perspective, I just saw this as just some old piece of junk, some worthless hunk of metal that's been sitting in a garage for 27 years. But from someone else's viewpoint, this old part is actually an asset with some real value. And I think sometimes, we can have a tendency to just see the obvious and miss out on the deeper value of things around us. Now, how does this relate to development? I think as CHE facilitators, development, it's a very fundamental concept for us. We use that word a lot. Some of our CHE lessons use the word development, relief and development. We define development in terms of how it's different from relief, the paralytic in development, Luke 2:52 in development, worldview in development. But I feel like I've noticed over the years that sometimes that word can be a little bit ambiguous in meaning. What do we mean by that exactly? And how is that word connected to assets? What do we mean by asset-based development? So to go a little deeper into that, I want to describe two different communities with you. Community A is basically a real community in crisis. They have many problems, high unemployment, drug addiction, violence, alcoholism, lack of educational opportunities. There's only a few small locally owned businesses in this community. Most people don't support those businesses. They'll go to like the big box stores that are outside of the area. This community's even gained national recognition, but not necessarily, recognition anyone would want. They're known as one of the most disadvantaged communities in the region, with a disproportionate number of people that have long-term health conditions and lack of educational opportunity. As a result of this recognition and all their problems, there's been tons of interventions and programs that have flooded this community over the years, but most of these programs have failed to bring about lasting change or deep change. And in fact, they've sort of only perpetuated a culture of dependency and hopelessness here. One community worker even said, we've given them so much, but received so little in return. They just don't learn, and some of them don't even seem to care. So let's talk here about community B. You know, this community has many long-term residents, people that were born here, and they actually, you know, if you ask them, they hope to stay here till they die. They love this community. They say that the neighbors generally are very helpful to one another. You know, if someone needs a ride to work because their cars broke down, you know, someone will help them out, or if they get sick, someone brings them a meal. They look out for each other's children, you know, when they're outside playing. There's this local youth football club that's really popular. A lot of children participate. Even adults from the area will go and watch the games, even if they don't have children there. They volunteer, help coach. It's really a place that is very positive for the community and helps bring the community together. Again, you know, the community is small enough. A lot of people know each other, and there are some problems. There's some troublemakers, some issues, but generally people look out for one another. And every year, one other thing is the primary school, they hold an annual festival, and a large number of people come out to support the school. So, you know, I guess if I were to ask you, which community would you prefer to live in? And actually, you know, Galen yesterday talked about one of the ways you can use Zoom for training is a poll. So I'm going to see if we can do this here. I'm sending out a poll, and the question is, which community would you think would be the best candidate for development? If you can see the poll, feel free to answer real quick. Good, I see some of you already doing it. We've got about 18 respondents, so 19. Well, it's pretty neck and neck, actually. All right, out of about 24 of you, we've got about 63% say that community A would be the best community for development. And about 38% of you are saying community B. All right, I'm going to end the poll, so if you didn't get to it, but thanks for answering. What if I told you, here we go, I show the results. I've never done that. Okay, so you can probably see the results. Anyway, how do I close this poll now? Sorry, I got to figure out how to close the poll. Okay, what if I told you though, actually, and I'm sure some of you are smart enough to figure this out, these were the same community, but looking at this community from two different perspectives. How many people already knew that? Raise your hand. Let me see if I can see. Anybody? I see a couple hands raised. Richard, you already heard this story, so we don't count you. Okay, anyway. So these are actually two different perspectives of the same community. You know, both views of this community were true to some degree, right? But they were based on different perspectives, different viewpoints, different experiences of the people that are living here and or working here. So let's think about some of the terms that we might use to describe these different views. You know, we might say, well, one's sort of a negative viewpoint, one's more of a positive viewpoint, one's like sort of needs-based, resource-based. We could spiritualize it a little bit. One is sort of a cursed community, one is a blessed community. So I guess the question is, how does this perspective relate to our definition of development? And I would essentially say we could boil it down to do two different perspectives of development: a needs-based view of development and an asset-based view of development. You see, the way that the community members see themselves and their community will greatly impact what they're able to accomplish in that community. So I'm going to repeat that. The way that the community members see themselves is going to greatly impact what they're able to accomplish. If they see through an asset-based lens, they're going to feel empowered. They're going to feel dignified. They're going to be motivated to participate in change and transformation. They're going to have more desire to contribute. They're more desire to work together. Their relationships will be stronger. But if they see through a needs-based view, it's going to be all the opposite. They're going to be unmotivated. They're going to be more accepting of just sort of the way things are. They're going to feel helpless, powerless, hopeless. And even more as outsiders, maybe as community workers, like you heard the one person talk about that had worked in that community, you know, how the community worker, the outsider enters has a great impact as well. We can either come in and we can highlight the problems and the barriers that they already have. We can focus on what's lacking. Have you ever done that? Maybe even inadvertently? I know I have. Or we can focus on the strengths and the potential of the community. helping them discover all the great things that God has already given them. So, yesterday, Mike said in his talk, he said that leadership is a mindset and behavior follows mindset. And that was really powerful. And I thought, wow, that just really aligns to what I wanted to share here. We have to recognize how much our mindset and the mindset of the local community influences and sets the trajectory of the development that will or will not happen. The mindset is going to set that trajectory, and it's going to lead to an outcome, whether it's the outcome we want or the outcome we don't. And I also like what Stephen Covey said in 7 Habits, one of my favorite books, but he said, paradigms are powerful because they create the lens through which we see the world. And if you want small changes in your life, you might work on attitudes and behaviors. But if you want to make big primary changes, you must work on the paradigms or the mental maps of how we see the world. And so I love this sort of picture. It's kind of funny, but probably in actuality, that's sort of the same person, because there's sometimes in life where we're going to see the whole, and we're going to feel like we're in that hole maybe. And then there's sometimes where we're going to see the assets. But I think a large part of what we need to do in ourselves and within the communities where we're working is retraining our brains to be more like the guy on the left who's seeing the assets. So here's another sort of picture, in a needs-based development, we sort of have this community represented as this ball down here on the bottom of the hill, or this boulder or whatever. That's sort of representative of the community. And what we have project goals sort of up here on this mountaintop. And, oftentimes these project goals in a needs-based development paradigm are set by the outsiders. So they're like, hey, you need improved health, you need clean water, you need access to education. And what do the community members do? Well, they just kind of go with the flow and say, okay, yeah, we need that. And your organization oftentimes will fly in, like the superhero with the cape on and say, hey, I know what we can do. We can get you up to these goals that we've set for you, right? Push you up the mountain. But then what happens when the person leaves, the organization leaves, or whatever, we know that the community oftentimes goes back to where they were before. The changes are not sustainable generally in a needs-based development type program. When the outsiders leave or stop the work, the community will generally digress back. So what's an alternative to this? If we change our perspective to more of an asset-based development mindset, we have the goals sort of down here in the valley. It doesn't mean they're lower goals. It just means that they've been identified and prioritized by the community. And then we can picture the community up here on top of the hill, right? And when sort of the ball's at the top of the hill, that generally would indicate that there's a potential energy there. There's just waiting to be released. But the problem is oftentimes there's some sort of barrier to this potential from being achieved. And that can be previous dependency, mindsets, poverty traps. I really like, what Dr. Weidick, who spoke at the face-to-face IWMC, he says in his book that oftentimes there are these individual or collective poverty traps that keep people stuck. And 3 of those he mentions are an aspiration trap, a self-confidence trap, or a hopelessness trap, essentially. And so as development workers, and with our CHE programs, one of the things that we do, we all know and really firmly believe this, I think, is that we do have a role to play, right? But that role is just simply to try to help remove those barriers. Our role essentially is to facilitate insights, to develop capacity, and basically to get out of the way. But we let them own it. It's their goals that they're prioritizing for their own community. It's their work, it's their planning, it's their potential, it's their energy. We're just simply trying to remove the barriers that are holding that back, basically. But once that barrier is removed, you can see that the community leads and drives the changes themselves. The community members, they dream, they participate, they contribute, they lead, like I said. So let's get a little more into just comparing here in a needs-based versus an asset-based development. In needs-based, you often focus on lack, where of an asset-based, we focus on capacities. Needs-based is, it's providing services. asset-based is really about relationship, particularly even relationships among the people in that community. It's like, how can we build their relationships and facilitate them trusting one another? But it's also the relationship with the organization. Then we have passive recipients versus active participants. Sometimes kind of like a church service, maybe. Sorry. We have results of a needs-based is more dependency, and asset-based results in more sustainability. Needs-based will reinforce that sort of poor me victim mentality. It's like, oh, I have nothing, right? Have you ever heard that before? I would probably imagine every single person on this call has probably gone overseas and met somebody. It's like, hey, you have that problem. Why don't you do something? I have nothing. But asset-based community development builds confidence. Needs-based development, I put paternalistic, but I mean, basically it's not really a big word, but it just means you're acting like a parent, right? In a needs-based development, you're like, hey, I'm the parent. I kind of know what you need, and I'm going to give you an allowance. I'm going to help you do it because you need me to help you do this, like sometimes we do with our children. But asset-based development is more of an empowering coaching model. The needs-based development will diminish potential. Asset-based development releases potential. Needs-based development will lead to sometimes further vulnerabilities, actually, because if they haven't done it themselves, then what happens when things happen? Because we live in a world where things are constantly happening. And look, right now we have COVID, right? For the past 2 years, nobody expected that. But asset-based development, it builds resiliency to things like that. And finally, needs-based is, people are often viewed as the problem, and in asset-based development, people are the solution. So, and I just highlighted that one because I think that one's so critical. The people are not the problem. They may have some problems. They may have some sin issues, but the people are in fact the solution. So, that leads to a really critical first question when you enter in with an asset-based community development model. And that question is, what's in your hand? Now, can everybody kind of see? You can feel free to write in your chat or whatever if you want. But what do you see there on the left? Or you can speak out. I don't care. Write it in the chat. Speak out. Let's see. Chicken coop. Good. Okay. Someone said chicken coop. Right. What else do you see? Wood. Good.
Vegetation.
Skills.
Something made locally, doesn't look like it was imported from Lowe's.
That's right. It wasn't like one of those build a shed kits that you can get. Broken door. Fertilizer for agriculture. Hey, let's hone in a little bit on that door. Is there anything in particular you notice about the door?
Doesn't seem to be anything behind it.
Nothing behind it?
It's open.
It's open.
Are those flip-flops?
Yeah, the hinges, right? So you're right. I don't think they had a Lowe's necessarily to go to go pick up some hinges. And so what they did was they asked their own question. Well, what's in our hand? What can we do to hold this door on here so when our chickens go in to keep the foxes out or whatever critter they have in this country, and it's like, oh, what about those old junky flip-flops that nobody uses, right? So, basically asset-based development sees potential where someone else might see junk, Like I've got an old pair of Doc Martens I'm wearing right now that have a hole in the sole and I'm about to just toss them. But, didn't know I could make a chicken coop door hinge with them. So maybe I need to reevaluate whether I should throw them away. But I think the next thing I want to say is that I really believe ABCD is in the Bible. A lot of people would say, hey, when was ABCD? When was that idea thought of? And if you look on the internet, it's like, oh, in 1990s, so-and-so thought of this concept of asset-based community development, started implementing. And I said, no, God thought of it way before that. And so I have 4 pictures here, and you probably can all recognize them and you've heard these stories. But I think these are sort of, there's elements of ABCD in each one of these. On the left, you have Elijah when, he's been, being fed by ravens at the brook, and the brook starts drying up. God says, hey, I want you to go to Zarephath, and you'll find a widow there who's going to feed you and take care of you. So he goes, and first widow he sees, he's like, hey, I need you to make me some bread. And she's like, sir, I've got, a little bit of flour in my hand, and I've got this wood. I'm literally about to go bake my last loaf of bread. And then me and my son, we're dead. We're dying. But Elijah's like, no, go and do it. And Lord's going to provide. And I just love it because when you read it, it's like, she says, I only have a handful. I only have. But God's like, I can take that, what you only have, and I can turn that into more. And then, of course, you have Moses, he's in the desert hiding out for 40 years, and God comes to him and says, hey, I've heard the cries of my people, and I want you to go and bring them out of Egypt. And he's like, who am I? He's stammering. He's like, I've got nothing. I'm nobody. They're not going to listen to me. And what's the question the Lord asked him? What's in your hand? And then, of course, on the far right picture is the story of Elisha, which is almost very similar to Elijah's story, where he goes to the prophet's widow, and she's like, I'm about to sell my kids into slavery to pay off all of our debts. I've got nothing, I was the prophet's wife, and we're in debt up to our ears, and life is terrible. And Elisha's like, well, what's in your hand? Hey, go to your neighbors, get as many jars as you can. See, that's where you start to see the community coming involved, and the oil keeps flowing until she runs out of jars, basically. But God uses what's in her hand and what's in her neighbor's hand to sort of sustain her and change her mindset. And then, of course, with the multiplication of the bread and the fish that happened both times. But Jesus is like, hey, he wants to show compassion on the crowds. Hey, disciples, let's feed them. What's in your hand, basically? And, of course, they only see lack. But God's like, I can use what is in your hand. I really believe that, God himself has put some form of asset into the hand of every single person and every community on earth. No matter, if you're living in a dump site, you have assets in your hand. We have to learn to look for these assets in faith, right? Even when they don't seem like much, even when the situation seems extremely dire, we have to look for these assets, and we have to offer them up to God. And God, we know that he can do more than we can hope or imagine. He's been placing assets and potential into our hands since the beginning of creation, right? Because he created us to co-steward with him and to create. And so God has put, again, an asset into everybody's hand. And so I think that's one thing that makes our ABCD a little bit unique versus sort of a secular approach to asset-based community development. And I'm kind of a goofy person here, but that's why I say we call it fabulous community development rather than creating another acronym, faith and asset-based community development, because it's God who takes even the little that we have and he can multiply it and make it much more. But I think, next, how do we make this practical? And, like I said, I've probably already been telling a lot of you things you already know and you've heard about and stuff like that. And I think we would all agree we want to facilitate an asset-based community development. But I think it's so easy to fall back sometimes into the trap of needs-based thinking. I mean, have you ever entered into a community and kind of just even accidentally said, well, what are your needs? I mean, maybe I'm the only one. I know I have. And we have a lesson called Needs and Resources. It's actually one of the best PLA lessons we have. I love it. And it's very participatory. It's super easy. It's super multipliable. But one of the questions I've really been struggling with the past year or so is like, why do we call it needs and resources? Why do we enter in with the needs part first? Should we flip it on its head and call it resources and needs? Should we spend more time discussing with them, what are your resources before we identify what are your needs? Maybe there's a good reason for it, but I just want to challenge that. And I want to challenge us all to start helping communities to think about what they've got, not what they've not. Start by building people up. So practically speaking, in Che, there's a few lessons scattered about asset-based community development in particular. And neighborhood transformation, which is the North American urban Che, is sort of put together an asset-based community development module, but it's really geared a little bit more toward a US-based context. And so what I did over the past year or so is I began pulling some of the lessons from Che and creating some of my own and creating a new module on asset-based community development that I hope, I haven't quite tested it yet, can be very useful in an international context. And so I'm just going to briefly walk you through just the high level of this. I sort of use an appreciative inquiry based approach, but I don't really like to use that word because some people are like, well, those are big words, appreciative inquiry. But it just really means like, hey, starting with what's working, start with what's strong, not with what's wrong, basically. And so, in appreciative inquiry, you have sort of a 4D cycle. I just got 3 of them listed here: discover, dream, and design. But really, in the discovery part, we just enter with a group like a church or something like that, or with our trainers. We just begin to help them challenge their perspective, kind of like what we've been doing here. Begin to challenge them to see, what they do have, and if we can get them to change their mindset a little bit. And then we begin to identify, there's already some good lessons in Che about identifying skills, gifts, and talents. But again, starting with helping them discover, what has God already given you personally and individually in terms of your own giftings, your own skills, your own experiences. And then, I sort of called it a community treasure hunt, but basically like having them spend some time doing some real asset mapping in their community, maybe before the module or whatever. But can they go out and really begin to look and catalog what their community has in terms of community resources and assets? And then finally, sort of in that, I guess you'd say, sub-module, just demonstrating that everybody has capacity. And so there's a story in there about a Cambodian woman who is an amputee and just saw herself as a victim and really unable to contribute. And other people in her community thought, what value does she have? But how she overcame that, and God is using her in a really powerful way in her community. And so just challenging people's perspectives, that people with disabilities, or maybe someone who, even has a addiction problem, begin to view them as resources and not just problems. So that's sort of the discovery phase of this. And then moving into the dream phase, there's such power in developing a vision for your community and knowing the power of vision, because vision is what motivates us to contribute. It motivates communities to get involved, to want to do something. So really helping them understand the power of vision. There's a good lesson in Che already about seeing the community through God's eyes, where there's a pastor and all he sees are problems in his community. Jesus comes to sort of talk to him and walks him through his community and really challenges his perspective again. Like, this is how Jesus sees it. This is the vision Jesus has for your community. And it's very different from your needs-based view. And then finally, getting the group or the church or whoever to actually tangibly draw something or put something together, like in terms of a dream map for their community that can guide them in terms of what they can do and what they hope to do. Dream map doesn't necessarily just focus on all the problems. It's more like, what are your dreams for your community? And it's something they can look to over and over the years and modify. And then finally, there's the design part. And I call this the look for what's strong, not what's wrong. But again, there's a consistent challenging of people's mindsets in this module. And so this first part is based on positive deviance, and just, again, not wanting to use those big words that aren't going to translate, but essentially, like, are there already things in your community that are working? Yeah, we recognize there's problems. You recognize there's problems, but are there places where those things aren't problems, and why? And beginning to explore that. And then the second one, I always call it the road to development, but it's actually the needs and resources lesson. And this is, again, just helping the community. Now it's time to begin to look at and prioritize, what are your problems? What are your needs? Because you've spent all this time before, maybe day and a half, whatever, building them up, helping them to dream, helping them to see what God has already put in their hand, essentially. Now I think it's time to go in and let's sort of identify some problems, and then sort of working through those problems, solution tree, problem tree, planning, maybe a seed project or something, and then taking some action. And this would eventually be followed up with the 4th D, which I think is sometimes called deploy, but that would be sort of where you take action, you maybe measure to see what went right, what didn't, and you celebrate, which I think is a really key element to asset-based community development, is the celebration. How often do people celebrate the accomplishments that they're seeing in their community as they're fulfilling their dreams within their community? So again, that's just sort of the idea behind this module. And I just want to give a brief testimony of a place in the Philippines. This is about an hour outside of Manila. And so they've sort of been going through this process since 2019 a little bit. And one of the things here is just, again, discover, there was a woman on the right, and she lived sort of in this community that has about 6 zones. And one of the zones is quite impoverished, actually. And I've been over there a few times. And, there's most of the men are day laborers. They're gone, in the city all week. And then the women, they generally would just kind of sit around in their pajamas and play games and, watch their kids. And there was a huge muddy lot. It was kind of like a mosquito breeding ground. You know what I mean? Nothing really being done with it. But actually the woman on the right, she actually had a job. She was working at the nearby zoo. And during COVID, the zoo shut down, and she had been there for 14 years. So she had not been able to participate in the CHE program up until the time of COVID. And so once she lost her job, rather than going home and just kind of saying, poor me, she started going to some of the CHE meetings. And while she was there, she actually accepted Christ, which was really awesome. But then she also began to really look at, like, what does God put in my hand? And she began to really look at this muddy lot that had been sitting there. And she's like, wow, I think we could turn this into a garden. And so she began to go out and cultivate it. I think it was 2020. And really, you can see the garden there is really flourishing. She got 5 other families actually involved in cultivating this garden. And they were all getting, nutritious food out of it. They were able to sell some of it for livelihood. It was really amazing. So 17 people in her zone ended up benefiting from what God was doing in her life through the discovery of the gifts and assets that God had already given her. And then, of course, on the left, she's an incredible volunteer, and she's got giftings in teaching. She's a CHE out sharing COVID prevention here. But one of the other things the team did, which was so good, was they helped them facilitate dream maps. Now, 2 of these maps are from this community, and 1 is actually from another place, but I just thought it was a cool map. But, they helped them sit down and think about, like, what do you hope to see in your community over the next few years? So I just wanted to show that. And a couple of the dreams that they had were improving roads and cleaning up, which is often, a lot of the dreams people have in different communities, because their roads are really muddy and potholes strewn and, difficult to pass over. And so you can see the gravel. They end up working with local authorities who end up contributing the gravel to cover a lot of their different pathways just this past year, actually. And they did a lot of the volunteer labor to help make that happen, people throughout the community. And then, like I said, there are 6 zones. And you can see this bamboo bridge. Well, the zone that's probably the most impoverished is sort of across this, I'd say it's about a football length field that gets really swampy in the rainy season. And so they had this sort of old, decrepit, really impassable bamboo bridge that they hadn't repaired or taken care of for years. And so one of their dreams was, we want to rebuild that bridge. And so they fulfilled that dream, came together, got the resources, rebuilt it. And what I really love about that story, though, is actually it goes so much beyond just this physical bridge. It actually has a deep, powerful message to it as well, between, like, reconciliation between 2 different parts of the community. Because, like I said, they were a little bit more impoverished, a little more ostracized, looked down upon. But when the other community members saw what they were doing, they gained a great higher level of respect for them. And it also motivated the other zones to want to participate in and do what they did. So that was pretty
La literatura que llamamos narrativa, los evangelios son tienen parte narrativa.
Let's see if I can find out. Okay, sorry, just muting. And then finally, ABCD really helps develop resiliency. So that same woman in the beginning, which she's a really incredible champion, that garden was really flourishing. Well, then a typhoon came in later that year and pretty much wiped out the entire garden. And so, I think that was probably a bit demoralizing at first. But what they began to do is they began to say, well, what else do we have? And, somehow someone knew how to grow some ornamentals. And they said, we've got some cement, we've got some old bags, we've got paint. So they started making these are actually cement pot holders that they made and painted with, like I said, cement, old rags. They began growing ornamentals off the ground, really improving just the look of the community, but they also started selling them. And so now all those families are participating in selling ornamentals to people both inside and even outside the community. It's become a little bit, it's got a reputation for just the soil and the quality of the product. So now people are coming in. Some people, they said, even come in and buy soil because they think it's just so good there. So again, 3 years ago, this thing was literally just trashed out mosquito breeding station. And now people are coming in and buying the soil from it. So that's pretty much all I wanted to share. I just hope you have a greater sense of the power of asset-based community development in your work. And perhaps even, maybe your paradigm has been challenged by this conversation. So I know mine has. The more I grow and think about this, because I was probably generally more the fish on the left here, but I think God's really working on me to be more of the, the guy on the right. So thank you.